America of third-year students. So the university, through the help of Dean Raul Sebastian and Professor MacDonald Pascual, partnered with a scholar from Peru so that the students of the university will learn the subject deeply. History from a true expert. In addition, we opened this lecture to the public so that other students, faculty members, researchers could also learn from our topic today. So it is also an opportunity for us to exchange ideas on Latin America. As a background, Latin America is a complex region full of contrasts. Its population is both racially and culturally heterogeneous. Its many countries share some common cultural roots and political origins, but also have distinct histories. Before its colonization, Latin America had been settled for millennia by a wide range of indigenous groups, some of whom are Aztecs, Mayans, and Incas, who boasted advanced civilizations. The Spanish were the first Europeans to arrive in the Americas, followed soon after by the Portuguese who colonized Brazil. To formally start this lecture, let's have a moment of silence to thank and praise our Lord, to be followed by singing of the Philippine national anthem.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فقال ربكم ادعوني أستجب لكم آمين يا رب العالمين الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين اللهم اجمع شمل المسلمين والكريستيان والأمة في مدينة دباو وسلم دائما مجتمعنا هذا بالسلم والأمن والتقدم في بلدنا هذا آمين يا رب العالمين ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وصلى الله على خير خلقه سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين آمين يا رب العالمين.
In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we come to you today to praise and worship you and give you thanks for all the things you continue to provide for ourselves and our families. Father, we humbly ask for forgiveness for all the times we have offended you, when we forget to acknowledge your presence in the image of our brothers and sisters, and for moments we fail to be good stewards of the blessings you have given us. Continue to guide and protect each one of us, Lord, that we may always walk in the light of your everlasting love and mercy. Grant us, Father, with your comfort in times of distress and with your strength in times of weakness. Bestow upon us your unending grace and healing, that we may in turn become instruments of gentleness and compassion to others. We ask all this in the name of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, with the prayer and the intercession of our Blessed Mother. Amen.
To formally start this lecture, let's hear from the founder and enthusiastic Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Development and opening remarks. May I call on Dr. Raul Roland R. Sebastian.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Attorney Mel, no, for for this opportunity. First of all, I would like to welcome our dear scholar ng bayan, our students in BA History, and of course, our colleagues, our faculty members. I believe there are some faculty members from other departments, but most of the faculty are from the Department of History. And of course, our friend from Peru, from University of Washington, Jorge. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. You know, when you delivered your first lecture in PUP, through the help of JP, most of us, all of us were amazed during the time. So we really appreciate your lecture. And again, I would like to take this opportunity that you accepted my invitation to be a part of this special visiting lecturer, special visiting lecturer program of the university. And of course, I would like to mention our university officials, because this kind of program will not be possible without the initiative of our university officials headed by our President Dr. Manuel Muhi and our Vice President Dr. Emmanuel C. de Guzman. So thank you for their support. Thank you for their initiative. At the end of the day, these initiatives are for the benefits, welfare of our students. And I hope that this is just the start of our more collaborations with you, Jorge, and of course, hopefully with your country, Peru. We hope that we can collaborate in many areas, especially in the fields of history and culture. Once again, welcome and thank you so much. Good morning.
Thank you po, Dean Sebastian, for that inspiring message. In this lecture, our speaker will deepen our understanding on the pre-Columbian cultures and narratives of Iberian conquest. He is Professor Jorge Bayona, who is a scholar from Peru. He is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Washington, and that his areas of research are Southeast Asia and Latin America. It is my honor to introduce to you Professor Jorge Bayona, a special lecturer of PUP Department of History. Sir, you may now start po. Thank you po.
Hello, maraming salamat to you, to Dean Sir Raul Sebastian as well. Thank you very much. Yeah. So yeah, masaya ako to be here. Patawad rin kasi ang Tagalog ko napakabarok pa. Kaya medyo mahirap para sa akin mag-lecture sa Tagalog. Kaya ang lecture na ito will be in English. There were a couple of things I wanted to ask. I was so when we start talking about our topic, I would like to ask you to please, like try to participate whenever. Raise your hand using the Zoom option to raise your hand if you have any questions or comments you would like to make. I'd like to be able to have a more conversational, interactive sort of lecture. I do also have to mention that so like I have my PowerPoint like in front of me, and if any of you should speak, I will be looking in this direction, which is where I can see your faces. And in that term, in that sense, I would like to ask you all, if at all possible, if you could turn on those of you who can and are willing. There's no requirement for this, of course, at least not on my end. Those of you who can and are willing, if you could turn on your cameras, that would be fantastic. It helps me. It makes me feel like I am talking. It makes this online experience, which is difficult, and I know we've all been going through a very, very difficult time. It helps me feel more connected with the people, with you all, who I am talking to. I know that things have been difficult in the Philippines. I am currently in Peru, where they're also very, very, very difficult. We're dealing with a second wave of COVID, and yeah, and it's definitely worse than the first wave. I don't know, about a month or two ago, we were undergoing a situation of yeah, people were just dying because of lack of oxygen. Right there was not enough supply of oxygen in the country. So it is a difficult time, and I'm very cognizant of that. It's a difficult time out there in the Philippines. It's a difficult time out here. So yeah, I mean, I think that is something we all have to acknowledge as we deal with this complicated scenario. So yes, if I see there's like 2 or 3 of you all who have turned on your cameras. I thank you. I thank you very much. I thank you wholeheartedly for that. Maraming salamat sa inyong lahat for doing that. But yeah, okay. So anyway, we have a lot of material to cover, and I know we only have like 3 sessions together, 2 hours each. So there's a lot of material that we have to pack into a very small amount of time. Now, um, from what I understand, Sir Melchor and I, we will be co-teaching this class, and we're very happy to be doing this. This is a very energizing experience for me, to have this opportunity to speak to the young scholars ng bayan sa Pilipinas, sa PUP, um, and to talk about this region that I am also very interested in, as Sir Melchor mentioned. I at the University of Washington, I'm working under Vicente Rafael, and I am studying the Philippines, but Latin America is my other field of expertise, and it is the region that I have been teaching about at the University of Washington, as well. I have taught four classes about Latin America at University of Washington. So I'm very happy to be able to uh, talk with you all about this region. Um, I was hoping that maybe you all could spend, let's say, 3 minutes writing very briefly. Let me bring up the chat. I would like to know a little bit about you all. Um, Especially the ones who are taking the class. I understand that several of you are guests, and that is great. Love to have you here. That is fantastic. But especially those of you who are taking the class, History of South America, I would like you to write me a brief email. Tell me who you are, um, what your interest in history is. What else? I will write them out so that we can, so that it's easy to reference. So, who you are, what your interest in history is, the languages you speak. I'm very interested. It's so fascinating for me to encounter, like in the Philippines. I feel like everybody speaks like two, three, or four languages, and I find that particularly fascinating. And then two or three unique things about yourself, because that way, like, I can get to know you a little bit better, so that you're not just like names on a screen, so we can get to know each other a little bit better. So I will give you like 3 minutes to do that, please, and I will read through them, and that way I can we can like interact a little bit better. Okay, 3 minutes for this, please. Okay. We should be ready to complete that about now. Huh. I haven't received any in my email. I suppose they should be. I hope they should be arriving soon, and that we haven't just spent 3 or 4 minutes just looking at each other through the through Zoom.
I think
Salamat sa.
they're
Yes,
writing. Sir.
they're writing.
They're
Okay. Salamat sa Sir McDonald. Uh, Japanese occupation of the Philippines. I think that's a very interesting period as well. Salamat sa Jamie Carlo Ebreo. Oh, Latin American history. Okay. I mean, we could have some fun conversations, Jamie. Please don't forget to send them to my email so that I can, because I think like the chats in Zoom just disappear once the meeting is closed. So, oh, what happened? Oh, can you still hear me?
yes, sir. Very clear, sir. Very clear.
Okay, I don't know what happened on my end. Something strange, but can you see my? I think my Zoom has. This is so annoying. What has happened?
We could hear you, sir.
Okay, but can you see my PowerPoint or no?
No, sir.
Okay.
Maybe you could turn off first your camera or video. Then you may turn it again after maybe 30 seconds or 1 minute.
Okay. My apologies for that. It just failed, and that has never happened before to my computer. It like my Zoom just crashed. Let's see. Okay. Let's get this. Okay.
No problem, sir. That's part of the changes in education system because
Yeah.
of online class. We always encounter problems like this one, sir.
Yeah.
Nothing to
Yeah.
worry.
Yeah. I mean, it is the technological world with all the glitches that entails. Okay. Nag-uumpisa tayo. Let us get started. Okay. I will have a chance to look at all the at the profiles later. Let's get talking. We have a lot of material to cover. And please remember, you can raise your hands using um the there's where is that? You should be able to raise your hand. Disable participants. That's interesting. Where is the raise hand feature? At any rate, well, you can find the raise your hand feature and use it to let me know when you would like to intervene. I welcome questions at any time during the lecture. If you have your video on, maybe you can raise your hand there if like if other options aren't possible, or maybe you could just write in the chat box that you have a question, and I will do my best to catch it and address your question. Anyway, Okay, let's get started. Indigenous America. So we're going to talk about the pre-Columbian world here, prior to the arrival of Iberian colonizers. Anyway, so first, there's a lot to so like chronology of settlements. Populations arrived in the Americas at a very early stage. Now, a lot of these numbers are constantly changing, so don't like this is not. I don't want you to necessarily burn these numbers, these dates into your minds, because there's always new archaeological discoveries being made. So but it's just to like get a notion of how population reached the Americas. And as you may see, in general, they did so for following a north to south orientation. So eventually, South America was the last region to be populated. There is some evidence of very small amounts of population arriving through the ocean. My apologies. From Oceania, from Pacific Islander populations. But in general, we're talking about people who cross the Bering Strait from Asia. Let's see. You can't hear me, huh? Can you?
We can hear you,
We
Jorge.
can hear
Loud.
you loud and clear.
Loud and clear. Okay. Ah, yeah. Not only did we have technological glitches, but now I'm coughing a little bit. But anyway, let us continue. These are just things that happen to us. So eventually, these nomadic populations that made their way into the Americas started forming macropolities, what you might also refer to as empires, which we will be able to speak about in more detail later. The famous Olmecs and the Toltecs in Mesoamerica, these are predecessors to the Aztecs. And in South America, in the Andes, you got all of these different cultures known as Chavin, Moche, Tiahuanaco, Wadi, which are also predecessors to the eventual Inca Empire. So that is one thing that we must remember. It is not like the Aztecs or the Incas are the civilizations themselves; they are like late manifestations of pre-Columbian cultures. Um, let's see, we do have different ways, different patterns of settlement. As we said, like in some cases, you do have urban populations, settlements especially in the places as Sir Melchor mentioned, there are the quote unquote advanced populations, but like we must use this very much in a quote idea, right? Like we think of them as advanced because they build these structures and very complex architecture and so on. But that is just one adaptation to the environment, one way of organizing society. So you see that in like Mesoamerica, which is like the Mexican area, and also in the Andes, where you do have very urban societies, large cities, complex markets, complex societies. But you also have semi-sedentary and also just nomadic populations throughout the Americas, indigenous peoples. And these are not, I mean, this idea of backward and advanced populations, an idea that arrived in some ways from Europe. It is also true, but at the same time, it is also true that it seems that Inca populations in the Andes, or people in Mesoamerica, like around like the Valley of Mexico, the Aztecs, would sometimes see people further afield as primitive or barbaric. But that is their way of seeing things. These other not quite as urban populations, these more hunter-gatherer or agricultural societies, semi-nomadic societies. It's not like they're more backward. It's just that they have a very different way of adapting to society. And this is something that we can even take from like Southeast Asian scholarship. Like James Scott, right? The Art of Not Being Governed, in which you have populations like being out in the nomadic regions. Your lifestyle is not necessarily worse than the people who live in the more advanced cities. As a matter of fact, it sometimes can be better. Hunter gatherers in general, I've read archaeologists and stuff that who said that yeah, apparently they only worked about 14 hours a week, 1-4, hunting and gathering. The rest of the time they just spent telling stories and just hanging out and reproducing and just just living their lives. When you live in a more complex society such as the Incas or the Aztecs, you are working more hours, many more hours per week, and you are in a society in which you have hierarchies as well. So it is not, so let us not try to, and hierarchies have their disadvantages, right? Like the big pyramids, the big monumental architecture that we will talk about as well is a result of social hierarchies, because nobody does the backbreaking work of building a pyramid because they feel like it. You would rather just hang out with your friends, but it's because you have people with power who can force people with less power to do this work for them. So it is different adaptations, right? There's different ways of dealing with these societies. Now, um, let us look, for instance, at some of these non-imperial agricultural waterway societies, and this will be one of the big divides in pre-Columbian history, because um, so the Iberians, they will be particularly fascinated by the by the complex empires of the Aztecs and of the Incas and the Mayas, but they will first encounter these other populations, the populations in the Caribbean and by the Spaniards, and the populations of the Amazon region. In the case of the Portuguese, these two Iberian societies that like head out into this area. So these societies are not like completely anarchic. They have chiefs, they have chieftaincies, but these are always more of a, you know, in and you are all students of Philippine history, so you might see some parallels with pre-Columbian Philippine society, right? You've read what's his name, William Scott, the guy from Barangay. Yes, no, yeah, right. His name is Scott, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes.
William Henry
So
Scott.
yeah, William Henry Scott. Yeah, I think that's the name. Yes, and like, so like in Southeast Asia, you also have that kind of thing, like, oh, like, where is the Philippines Borobudur, where's the Philippines Angkor Wat, and so on. And it's not a matter of like pre-Columbian Filipinos being like more primitive. It's just like, like they had better stuff to do with their time than just like do the backbreaking work of building these of building these temples, right? They have rich societies and so on. So and there's that whole thing that rather than build buildings and decorate them, they decorate their own bodies, right? And so on. Um, and in some ways, you can see that kind of social organization, like the barangay being this kind of democratic situation, and not democratic in the sense that they would hold elections, but in the sense of like, you know, chieftaincies are not necessarily hereditary, and you see that kind of thing in these chieftaincies in the Amazon and in the Caribbean. It is like one of those situations in which it is like uh, the the ability is the thing that decides who the next leader is going to be. And they had pretty dense populations. And once again, we are not talking about primitive populations who just like hunted and like gathered fruits. They do have farming as well. um and as a matter of fact, like the part of the reason the Spanish were able to settle was because they found all these lands ready to farm. The people die, but the land is ready to go. Um, and yes, and you can see some of their staples, their staple crops, cassava in the case of the Tainos in the Caribbean. Amazonians have corn, manioc, and so on. And these allow them to have small surpluses so that they can have like a stable society. Of course, mainland societies will eventually develop much larger surpluses. And once again, these are not primitive, isolated populations. The populations of these are very water oriented societies. It's the and this is something that should be very familiar to you all, as well as students of maritime Southeast Asian history. Uh, the land that is across the water is often closer than the land on the other side of this of one's island, right? It is these are peoples who manage the water very very well. In the case of the Caribbean peoples of the Tainos, the ocean, the Caribbean Sea, this all these islands, and in the case of Amazonian peoples, the Amazon River and all its tributaries, right? These are very water oriented peoples, and they were able to engage in very long distance trade using these waterways. Now, let us get to the mainland cultures, the ones that have always attracted so much attention. Now, I want to make sure. Can somebody raise their hand using the Zoom ability for that? I just want to make sure that that option is okay. So yes, raising hands is enabled. So if you have any questions or comments to make at any point in time during the lecture, please raise them, and I will be happy to address them. The more we talk to each other, the better, as I am concerned. This is I prefer interactive sort of classes rather than like just me talking unilaterally at you. Because for that, then we could just have you could just get a recording of somebody talking about Latin American history, right? Like conversation is always dialogue is always best. Now, so Sir Melchor, do you have a question or comment?
No, sir. I just tried to raise my hand to make sure
Okay.
that it's working, sir. Later,
Okay,
sir.
perfect.
Later. I will ask questions, sir. Thank you.
Fantastic. Excellent. I'm excited. Okay, so the Mayas, the Aztecs, and the Incas, and you can see these examples of their monumental architecture, right? Um, Whereas the peoples of the Amazon or the Tainos in the Caribbean, they're often their places of worship are just like clearings in the forest. They put a few rocks here and there, but they their impulse is not so much towards building great temples. It is rather worshiping within the constraints of nature, which is what works for them. Remember, eat all of these monument like constructions of monumental architecture, they require a lot of labor, and a lot of this labor is not always the freest labor out there. People are being forced to work, not necessarily slavery, which is something we're going to talk about as well, but it is there is a certain degree of coercion going on. Over here on the left, oh, I think we missed the big pyramid. Well, whatever. This is the one on the left. Let's see. This one is Maya. I forget. Is it Palenque? I forget which archaeological site particular this is. This one over here in the middle, I think that's Teotihuacan in Mexico, and this one, of course, Machu Picchu in Peru. All of these examples of great monumental architecture. Um, and yeah, so we pay a lot of attention to these cultures because of their monumental architecture. And what is the implication of that, right? What we have to like check our uh check our biases as historians, right? You're all like studying history. And yeah, I don't know. Does anybody have a comment? What are the implications of focusing so much on cultures that have monumental architecture? Does anybody want to comment on that a little bit?
Hello, Jorge. Good morning.
Yes.
Okay. We look at these monumental architectures because we would like to be reminded of our. Of course, these are monumental architectures that were done by the people of the ancient period, and well, their present condition is just simply like that. I mean, we cannot. I don't know if we can still rebuild them to how they were, to how grand they were during the colonial period.
Yes, and they're so impressive, right? Like if anybody can like visiting these great places are like truly awe-inspiring, right? These are quite majestic. Now, a lot of what we get from these cultures has also come through us through the eyes of Spanish conquistadors and colonizers and Portuguese colonizers as well, right? And they are used to, from their perspective, like they're used to the idea of monumental architecture as well. You have to have like the great cathedrals of Spain and Portugal, so they try to find that as well out there, right? Or the great mosques as well. Remember, like Spain is called it had that whole Al Andalus phase. 700 years, maybe a little bit more than a phase, but still. Um, and so the Iberians themselves, they came and they tended to think of populations in the Caribbean and in the Amazon as primitive, while the populations out in the Andes or in Mexico as more advanced. But as we were talking, that is kind of like that is a prejudice from that period. We have to try to like get beyond these ideas. And a little side note, have any of you been like ever seen that History Channel show of like ancestral aliens with the guy with the big hair who always says that everything was built by aliens? And there's always that thing that is always I'm like, really, really what? And have you noticed how every time it's if somebody says that aliens built something, it tends to be not white people stuff, right? Machu Picchu, built by aliens. Angkor Wat, aliens. I think when the French first saw Angkor Wat, they said like, I bet. So it's a historical thing that is mutated, right? In the present, people talk about aliens. In the 19th century, when the French first saw Angkor Wat, I think they started saying like, there's got to be a missing white race around here. This must have been built by white people and then they disappeared. And then now you have all these brown people walking around who couldn't, because brown people building this, that can't really happen. That was the mindset. And that mindset has now become aliens, right? Because I don't think I've ever heard of anybody walking into the Sistine Chapel, the Michelangelo thing, and going like, wow, look at that painting, must be aliens. There's not that many people who look at the Leaning Tower of Pisa and go like, aliens. It's always somebody. It's always like non-white people's like constructions that are attributed to aliens. So there's, like monumental architecture's always had that kind of like mysterious, like this aura of mystery that people try to attribute different things to. Anyway, so empire, ethnicity, warfare. What are we have to like think about what empires are and what makes a difference between an empire and just your regular chiefdom or kingdom and so on. And the thing is, we've talked about how like there is incredible diversity in the Americas. And one thing that is important to understand is that especially the Aztecs and the Incas, they are imperial states. Are they exactly like the empires of Europe and the Mediterranean world? Not necessarily the same thing, but they still have certain like, but yeah, of course. Is being like the Roman Empire the only way of being an empire? No, you can have different ways of being imperial. And what you have here, like the general thing about empires is that they're multicultural. An empire that is culturally homogenous isn't really an empire. It's just a really big kingdom or a really big nation or a really big whatever you want to call it. An empire requires multiculturality, but not a multiculturality of equals, but rather you have an ethnic group that conquers and dominates over the other ethnic groups. There is a hierarchy of ethnicity, there's a hierarchy of power. And you do have populations that are subject populations to the hegemonic populations. So what you have in both of the, especially in the Aztecs and in the Incas, is a great multiplicity of ethnic identities. Many, 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 many different ethnic identities, many different languages, many different religions or like deities to be worshipped, different cultures and so on, but they're dominated by these relative, comparatively small ethnic groups. In the case of the Aztecs, it's the Mexicas, where the word Mexico comes from. This is one particular group that whose story is that they immigrated from like Arizona down to like Mexico, to the Valley of Mexico, where they were treated very badly, but then eventually through pure gumption and power, they eventually became a great empire. They conquered their neighbors, they allied with some, and they eventually set up this great empire. In the case of the Incas, the dominant people are the Inca, and the Incas are a small, relatively small ethnic group who managed to dominate a large number of people. How does a small number of people conquer so many other peoples? Well, you conquer people, you subordinate them, you give them certain privileges, and you make them your allies. So, and that is how you make an increasingly large large empire. And a lot of people eventually, they just go like, okay, the empire is coming, we might as well. If you can't beat him, join him. So these are not nations. Not everybody in the Aztec Empire speaks the same language. They don't speak the Aztec. They don't sing the Aztec national anthem. It is like a very. These are very. These are confederations of peoples in a constant state of negotiation. These are not stable. Stable like all empires. All empires are always in a state of negotiation, of contestation. People are all there. There's always people who want to break free from the empire. Um, so it is an unstable. Empires are inherently unstable. So these are the two major regions that we're talking about. The Mesoamerican region, where you have the Aztecs and the Mayas. The Mayas are a little bit different. So the Aztecs are definitely, much more imperial. The Mayas appear to have been more of like a conglomeration of different city states. And each city state, and they fight against each other. They might ally with each other. They might try to conquer each other. But so it's not like it's a single Maya empire or Maya kingdom. There's many little kingdoms. They share many things. They share culture. They might share language to a certain degree. They might share deities to a certain degree. But it's, I don't know. In some ways, it might be like Renaissance Italy, in which you have all these different. You have like Venice and you have Milan, and they're all fighting with each other. But they broadly go like, we're all Italy, kind of, but like we all do our own thing. And so that is the northern sector, and then the Andes in the south, right, where you have the rise of the Inca. This is the Andean region where you have many different cultures prior to their rise, and that is also an important thing to point out. If one talks about civilizations, what you have is a Mesoamerican civilization with certain languages and certain traditions. You have an Andean civilization in the south, with the Incas and the Aztecs just being like the latest manifestations of these uh, of these cultures. If we were to think about it and like if we try to make a simile with Europe, which is always a complicated thing, trying to do similes between different regions, right? But like what you have there is Western civilization and the federal and the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, like the German Federal Republic, is so there isn't that federal German civilization. It is like federal Germany is one thing, one manifestation of Western civilization. If there is such a thing as Western civilization, complicated question, but I think you know what I mean in that respect. So millennia of civilization, but the civilization is not the Aztec civilization. It's not the Inca civilization. These are states. The Incas and the Aztecs in particular are these relatively small, powerful ethnic groups who managed to build states, incorporating and subjugating other peoples who are also Andean, who are also Mesoamerican, but they're not specifically Inca or Aztec. Now, how did they expand? You have a situation of chronic warfare, conquest. These are regions with very intensive agriculture, very intensive transformation of terrain. Um, the Incas also have their own version of the rice terraces of Banawe, right? But it's rather like potatoes. And they've got, so like it is especially the Andes is an incredibly hostile terrain, but they transformed it, and they were able to get surpluses. And once you have surpluses, you can start building empire. We already talked about how they're relatively small ethnic groups, and of course these more complex societies develop aristocracies. Aristocracies rule of few. These are people of high social position, and these high social positions become uh, become hereditary. I have a question from R.R. Avellana. Jorge, can you elaborate on the time context frame of Mesoamerican civilizations, like what years AD? Gracias. De nada. Podemos ver Ustedes hablan español también, ¿no? Estudian español. I've seen that you study Spanish. Podemos hacer la lecture en español. ¿Puede? ¿Puede va? No? Hindi puede? Yeah, I mean, your Spanish is probably better than my Tagalog. But anyway, so this is kind of like a broad chronology, and look at like the final line I think is particularly important. As you may see in the case of the Incas and the Aztecs, they're like coming up very late in the game, and this also plays a role in their fall. The Incas and the Aztecs were barely 100. Their empires, their states were barely like 100 years old by the time the Spanish arrived. So that is an important factor to take into account. Their ancestors had been around forever, but like as you know, there's a thing such as ethnogenesis, right? That they create their ethnic identity, and they start creating the state, and that was a very recent event. I hope that answers R's question. Where were we? So yeah, aristocracies. You do have aristocracies. These create hereditary hierarchies in society. And remember, this is something that other kinds of like simpler societies, simpler, less complex societies, always quote unquote, are sometimes actively trying to avoid. You all in these in like more hunter gatherer societies, it's interesting to see like what their epic stories are about. The epic stories of peoples who build empires, like the Andean peoples and Mesoamerican peoples, are like, oh, there was this great man who arose and he subjugated everybody and he became an emperor. Wow, what a great story. Um, the epic stories of peoples who reject empire formation in the case of the Americas, the Amazonians or the Caribbeans, is often more of like, there was this terrible guy who wanted to create an empire, but we killed him. It's like nobody should rule over nobody else. They have like different understandings of what the good life is, right? Um, so you do have aristocracies, you do have social hierarchies that are hereditary, and like you start having like a very stratified society. Also, empires tend to create to create and to petrify, so crystallize gender roles, right? Women do this, men do that. Men go to war and create empires. Women stay at home and they weave textiles, all of which can be very important roles. And both the Andes and in Mesoamerica, women were often assigned ceremonial religious roles, which of course are very important in societies, right? So, I mean, there is some degree at least there's much more equivalence and interdependence and reciprocity between the gender roles than what eventually the Iberians would bring, right? One of the things that the Iberians found absolutely detestable about the Americas was that in the Aztec and the Inca empires, women could be priestesses. That they were like, wow, that really shows how savage they are. Whereas in other societies, and sa Pilipinas rin, 'di ba? Like women could be ceremonial priestesses and stuff like that. There was that element as well. And of course, whereas the gender roles are much looser out in the less and the non-imperial social organizations. Now, um, a little bit about the Aztecs, and we really can't go the Babaylan priestesses in pre-Columbian or pre-Hispanic Philippines. Now, we are running behind, so I would love to go into more detail specifically about like what makes the Aztecs and what makes the Incas. What can we say? Well, there's some number, there's some information there. Hmm, some things that we need to keep in mind with the Aztecs, that they have enemies very um, uh, bitter enemies that they were unable to conquer. And this will play a role when the Spanish come along. The Tlaxcalans, the Tarascans, and so on. And of course, that the Aztecs participated in flower wars, and these are fake wars. These are ceremonial wars that you carry out against other people uh, for the purpose of taking captives, of capturing people whom you could use for human sacrifice for the god Huitzilopochtli, and so on. And that, of course, is not that popular. There's this whole cosmological reason why they needed to do that. It's not that the Aztecs are just crazy savages. There is a logic to it. But of course, if you're not an Aztec, you don't appreciate your people getting captured. But then again, they would capture each other's people and sacrifice them. So some of the people that they're participating in the flower wars are also participating in the same culture. So they also need to sacrifice. The Incas, once again, I would love to go into more detail, but we only have so much time. They also have this issue of people who they've conquered very recently or who they have not conquered and that are willing to cooperate with the Spaniards later. Yes, I have a question from Cedric.
Sir, can I ask po yung if the chocolate po is from an Aztec word? The history of the chocolate po is from Aztecs daw po.
So it is Mesoamerican. Cacao is from the Mesoamerican region. It was valuable. Sometimes they say it was used as currency. That is, there's discussion around that from what I understand. Yeah, but I don't know if I could give any more major detail about that. But yeah, I mean, but it's from before the Aztecs, right? Remember that the Aztecs, as such, are a very very recent thing, but they've been cultivating cacao for a much longer time. Okay, so about the Incas. So what you have here is an empire that is also very recent, much like the Aztecs. They have people who they don't conquer. But yeah, so what you have, like the case of the Incas is one of those cases in which you can see like it's a snowball effect. The Incas began small, but as they started succeeding, they started to become so powerful that they could just bulldoze over everybody else. The Incas could just build longer roads. They have so much labor at their disposal, so much energy that they can build roads, which at the same time enable them to move their armies faster and conquer other people. Why are their armies so big? Because they have more labor. They can also build warehouses where they can store all their excess production, all their food surpluses, so that when the army needs to go somewhere, they can move very quickly because they don't have to take their own food because the food will be waiting for them. They also have an imperial bureaucracy. All of these are technologies of empire that the Incas were able to develop. And eventually, once they showed up, like at your village or at your small ethnic group, and the Incas go like, hey, you can join us the easy way, or you can join us the hard way. You just go like, you know what? Okay, yay, Inca Empire, right? You join the and if you don't, then they can completely obliterate you militarily because they just have a much bigger economy. So here are some quick takeaways that we want to get from this thing. From the pre-Columbian period, you have great ethnic diversity. And we're not just talking about like, oh, yes, there's Aztecs in one place and Incas in the other. Within both of those empires, there's a lot of ethnic diversity as well. And that, they have built empires that are multi-ethnic, that give options to the conquered peoples so that they can like rise within the Aztec Empire or the Inca Empire. But it's always, empires are always intrinsically hierarchical, and eventually these would be the ones that fall the strongest to Spanish and in this case Spanish colonialism. Now, the Iberian Peninsula, we have to talk about this as well, but since we have a lot of material to cover, and from what I imagine, you're probably all familiar with what happened in Spain prior to its expansion, right? The Reconquista and all that. So maybe we can just go through this very quickly. These are the slides that I use at the University of Washington, although I've definitely condensed them. And I've already cut a lot from the Iberian Peninsula. But you know what? I'm just going to assume that as history students, you know the Iberian Peninsula well. Okay, so let's move along. Iberia, Castile, the Muslims, the Reconquista. You got Portugal doing their thing. So let's just skip to the takeaways. Make sure that we're on the same page. I trust that you know your Spanish history. So in general, Iberia is like, in order to understand the conquest of the Americas, we have to understand like Iberia's background as this multicultural crossroads. You know, you got Christianity, you've got Islam, you've got Judaism, all intersecting in Spain, and that will definitely very strongly inform the way that they understand uh, the Americas. They read a lot of what they see in the Americas in terms of Islam, for instance. When they first encountered big temples in the Americas, some of their they described them as mosques. We saw these mosques, and it's like, yeah, those aren't mosques, but like that is what they expect to see. And you know this as well because once the Spanish made their way around the planet and they landed in the Philippines, what did they call the Muslims in the South? They use the same word that they use for like Muslims in southern Spain, right? Moros, right?
Or
It's
more.
that is yes. Yeah, Moors or Moro. Yeah, exactly. Very good. John Dave, Christopher John. Excellent. Exactly. So that is what they're bringing with them. That is their baggage. This is a very militant Christianity. You are well aware of that, right? Spanish conquest is very deeply imbricated with religious conversion, right? Maybe you've read you've read Professor Vicente Rafael's work as well, and so on. It needs you need to have both. Like unlike other empires that were kind of like, well, as long as you obey us, we're fine. You know, like the British or the Dutch, they're not really that much into like converting people to the religion, but the Spanish definitely were, and this is a direct result of the Reconquista period. And they were also searching for commodities that they could take advantage of. But let's talk about Africa. Africa is where the action's at because Africa is often like overlooked when we talk about Latin American history. When I studied in college in Peru, like all my classes were always about like, oh, all the details. We were always taught about the whole thing: Aragon, Castile, Navarre, Leon, Queen Isabel, King Ferdinand, and who married whom, and then you have Juana la Loca, and all of these things. We know all the details about Spain, whereas they go like, oh yeah, and Africa, slaves came from there. Okay, lesson over about Africa. So I'm always like very interested in pushing Africa and trying to like talk back to that narrative that emphasizes Europe and sacrifices everybody else, right? Like everybody else is seen as secondary. But I want to talk about Africa a bit. So Africa definitely has a big role in the history of Latin America. Afro Latinos are a very large population. There are far more African people of African descent who were enslaved who went to Brazil than they went to North America, to the United States. For instance, those of you who follow soccer and like watch the Brazilian national team might have a notion of this, and like Brazilian music and so on, especially Brazil. But like enslaved people from Africa were present throughout the domains of Spain and Portugal. So let's get a quick idea of what is happening in Africa. Now, one of the first things that we need to uh, speak, clap back at, like to speak back at, is this idea that, you know, centuries of European colonialism have ingrained in our minds the idea that Europeans were more advanced than everybody else, like forever. That this is and of why were they able to set up like these vast empires? Oh, because they were more advanced in everything. But that is not true, and we can see this very clearly in the case of Africa. African textiles were far superior to European textiles of the same period. We're talking about the 15th century, 15th, 16th century. Um, like when they first started establishing contact with sub-Saharan Africa, Europeans would try to sell their textiles, and the Africans would be like, "Okay, this is your woolen textile of that is your gray textile, woolen textile is okay, fine. It at least has the novelty behind it, but compared to African textiles, there were really nothing to write home about. The Europeans would bring their metalwork, and Africans would once again not be that impressed. The Europeans would try to sell metal tools. Portuguese and Spaniards would try to sell metal tools, but African metallurgy was actually superior to European metallurgy of the time. They would buy it, but for the same reason that, maybe we could there's a stereotype that Chinese manufacturers, like electronic manufacturers, are lower quality than like European or Japanese or American, but people still buy them because they're cheap. So Africans would buy these cheap ass European manufacturers and be like, yeah, okay, whatever, they're cheap. Like they're low quality, but they're cheap, so we can buy that. Because their own metal objects, their own metal manufacturers uh, were better. So that is important to remember. And you have like these are very complex societies. They have very long range trading networks. They are not this backward people that Europeans have tried to like portray them as later. Um, in general, like a lot of the impression of Africa is created by Europeans in the 19th century after they've conquered them and impoverished them. It's kind of like us as, like looking at Europeans in 1945 or 46 and saying like, wow, Europeans are really backward. Like they live in these bombed out houses with no electricity and no water. Like what a primitive people. Of course, they're living in primitive conditions. World War II just ended, right? So it's kind of like that sort of context. Um, so what you have in Africa is this abundance of so like society and the economy. What you have is abundance of land. What is scarce is people. So like there's no real point in like private property over land. What is valuable is people. So what you do, whereas in Europe they were kind of always concerned about conquering land from each other, in Africa it was more about conquering energy from each other. So because land without people to work it is kind of pointless. So what you do have is enslavement. There is slavery in Africa before the Europeans arrive. However, this kind of slavery is perhaps more akin to the kind of slavery that there was in the Philippines, right? The pre-Columbian slavery, raiding, you would raid and take people, incorporate them into your ethnic community for energy, rather than the eventual chattel slavery that they had in North America, right? In which, or the Americas in general, where the enslaved person became complete, property, just an object that you can treat however you want. If you own a plate and you want to break the plate, go crazy. That's your plate. That's your. I mean, you get angry and you want to destroy your table. Okay, whatever. That is something that is not really a thing in Africa. Christopher says, yeah, Pangangayaw, the Philippine raiding, right? People in the Philippines were raided and then incorporated into society, into the raiders society, right? They could marry, they could even become raiders themselves eventually, right? So it's more kind of like in that direction rather than like the European direction. These are their trade, like the river networks. They could also trade along the ocean. Yeah, we don't have to really go into that as much. Africa in the 15th and 16th century, many, many complex states. And of course, like the Songhai Empire, like you've heard of Timbuktu. Timbuktu is still like this legendary place. There was this, it's incredibly wealthy area, lots of gold. At some point, I think I want to say 13th or 14th century, like the emperor of Songhai, uh, of the emperor of Mali, which is I think Mali is a successor of the Songhai Empire. He went to do he went to Mecca to do a pilgrimage, and he took so much gold with him that he created inflation everywhere he went because there was so much money. So like incredibly wealthy, incredibly complex societies, of course, with hierarchies, with enslavement as well, right? But remember, this is much like Philippine enslavement. You have like social mobility. It isn't racialized slavery because when how would you racialize people who are broadly looking the same, right? Who have like at least superficially seem like similar. So you have all of this complexity. Remember, it is much later that Europeans try to push the idea of like, oh, Africans are just a bunch of like primitive tribes. No, we're talking about complex kingdoms, complex empires that, for the most part, held their own against the Europeans. And remember, they do not really manage to conquer any part of Africa during this early the 15th, 16th, 17th century for the most part. And the thing is, most of the exchange between Europeans and Africans during this formative period is commercial, not conquest. And it's not conquest because Europeans were like, no, let's not conquer them. They're so cultured and civilized. No, Europeans did try to conquer them. It seems during this entire I don't know why, from the 15th century onwards, whenever Europeans encounter somebody foreign, they go like, let's conquer them. Like that is their first go-to response. I don't know why. Like they go into the Indian Ocean, they see like Vasco da Gama, he sees all this fantastic stuff in India, in Sri Lanka, in Southeast Asia, and he sees like, wow, such a cultured port, so much wealth. I try to conquer it. Like it's always this impulse. I don't know why, but in Africa, they failed systematically. They always failed because the Africans just defeated them all the time. They had no military superiority over Africans. They came in with their ships, but the Africans had these like fast boats with rowers, and the thing is they could just dodge what the Europeans fired at them with the really slow, inaccurate cannons, and eventually get close enough and just climb onto the ship and kill them. So you have all of those things. There's just, and remember, African metalworking is superior to European metalworking. So it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work for the Europeans. They try to conquer Africa, it doesn't work. So then they start trading, and they start trading for people. Uh, and you might say, like, why are Africans selling their own people to Europeans? But remember, there is no idea of Africa. There is no idea of like we are all a united Africa and we should be fighting against the European colonizer. It's just like, these are people. I am from this state. I conquered these. I captured these people on a raid from this other state. They're not my people. I can sell them. Um, Remember, like there was no united Philippines prior to colonialism, right? You're just like different groups. It's the 500 anniversary of the Battle of Mactan and that whole thing, and how Lapu-Lapu and what was the other guy, Humabon or something, and they're like, like they're just different groups and they're just fighting against each other. Um, so you do have that going on. So they would just sell these people, and also they don't actually necessarily know what they're selling these captives into. They don't know just how horrid the Europeans were gonna treat them. So you've got that, and the Europeans are buying them to use them for labor. I'm gonna have to like pick up the pace a little bit because I'm so yeah. You do have this very interdependent cycle of selling people to the Europeans. So in some ways, sometimes there's people who say like, well, white people never enslaved Africans. The Africans enslaved them first and then sold them to white people. So white people are innocent. Not true. Incorrect. Number one, because it's inaccurate. Because in Congo, in Angola, the Portuguese were able to set up a colony. They were able to conquer, and they would enslave people themselves, and then they would ship them off to Brazil. So number one, inaccurate. And number two, like, yes, it is one thing. So yes, sometimes those are people who the Africans enslaved from each other first. But also, there's this thing. how many times does a person get enslaved? Do you get enslaved just the one time when they first catch you, or are you enslaved every day that you continue to be treated as a slave? So a lot of people go like, oh, like some people might get defensive. No, 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 no. Like, like how there's that whole debate in the U.S. about like people about slave owners and stuff like that, and they go like, "Oh, but George Washington is innocent because he inherited his slaves. He never went to Africa and caught anybody." But like at the same time, if you have a person who like somebody else tells you, "Well, this is your slave," you can like every day that you treat them as a slave, you're also enslaving them, right? So there's that, right? Anyway, so that was happening, and you can see here in this map the volume of people who were moved by colonialism, and just how many ended up in Brazil, and how many ended up in the Caribbean. So these are very large movements of people, and the African presence in Latin America is massive, huge, and hugely important. Uh, and also to remember, and we all must also remember that Africans were definitely not more primitive than Europeans in this, and always primitive, quote unquote, because that's always a very controversial, like debatable concept. So yes, they tried to colonize them, didn't work, but you do have this entire history of enslavement, but it was always operating in very, very different terms. Now, let us get to conquest and colonization, and we're zipping through this. Um, this is a map of early European explorations. You're probably at least somewhat familiar with this, so we don't need to like really talk about that in that much detail. The Treaty of Tordesillas, that famous treaty whereby Spain and Portugal split up the world between them. They did, this half for Spain, this half for Portugal. You might notice over here that the line gives a little bit of Brazil to Portugal, and that's how Brazil eventually became a thing. As you may notice, the Philippines should have been Portuguese, but the Spanish kind of like skipped over the line in that side as well. So there's a lot of they're both skipping, crossing the line in both sides. And of course, all of that is made up, right? They're like, just because the Pope and a couple of European kings got together and said like, okay, let's split the world up this way. It's made up. There's no legal. They might say it's legally valid, but it's made up. You can't just decide who gets what that you don't even know about, because it's not like they specifically decided to give Portugal a bit of Brazil. They didn't even know Brazil was a thing when the treaty was made. Now, let's talk about who came to the Americas. In general, we're talking about lower, so it's not the elites. And why not the elites? In general, these are people who are migrating in a way, except that when, today we understand that when you migrate, you go somewhere else and you kind of broadly follow the rules, right? But whereas these people are just going and taking over. But who migrates? The people who are doing really well in the home country, or people who aren't doing that well in the home country? The people who are doing really well have no motivation to migrate, right? They're doing excellent. They're having a great time. It is people who like feel kind of like not achieving their full potential, and they think like, okay, I'm going to go somewhere else. I'm going to go abroad, and that is where things are gonna work out for me. So you got all these different lower class people. The painting that we got over here is Francisco Pizarro, the conqueror of Peru. There's always this talk about that maybe he might have been like a pig farmer when he was and illiterate. I don't know for sure. And there's all Pizarro being the kind of character he is. There's always that, like, to what degree they're making stuff up for about them and stuff like that. So yes, they want plunder, fortune, but they're also very religiously convinced that they need to spread the Christian word by violence if necessary. Religion of peace, but I bring it with a sword. Fun times, fun times. The 16th century has a very flexible idea of what like the proper spread of Christianity should be. Anyway, so the first place where they made landfall was the Caribbean, and they had to decide, well, what are we going to do here? And for a moment, they do wonder, should we set up like factorias? And a factoria is not a factory; it's like a little outpost, a trading outpost. Should we set up like trading outposts and trade like we do in Africa, or should we conquer the people? They do think about it for a second, and then they definitely go like, you know what, let's conquer them. It's always they always end up doing that. So they do set up a first factoria, but then they start, waging war against the population of the Caribbean islands. And yeah, it's a very difficult war. Lots of people die. Um, they just aren't armed. The Caribbean peoples are just not armed well enough to resist this kind of warfare on the part of the Spaniards. But the important thing about the Caribbean is that it starts setting up the first notions of what the conquest is going to be. They start with there is an early idea of like just trying to marry into the local nobility, but that just doesn't really work out all that well. They have the encomienda, and I will assume you all know the encomienda, right? Because you have encomienda in the Philippines. We don't need to explain that again. They do have like the reducciones. You have reducciones as well in the Philippines, so we can move on with that. Um, and yes, you have this obsession with finding mineral resources and being willing to enslave indigenous and African peoples in order to get these resources. Remember, for the Iberians in general, the Spanish in particular, it is always this idea of like, I come here to be a great man. I come here to be a lord over people. I am not planting my own sugar. I am not harvesting my own sugar. I have brown and black people to do that for me. There is no idea of like, I'm just going to carve out my own little farm. That is, and you're familiar with this, right? You have that same history in eventually in the Philippines. So look at all this as a preview of, like the background, the backstory of the Spaniards who eventually did go to the Philippines. You do have the same phenomenon of demographic collapse. The demographic collapse of the Caribbean is almost complete. We're talking about more than 90% of the people died in the Caribbean, and we will talk about the causes for that kind of death in a little while. So takeaways: you do have these complex farming societies in the Caribbean, but the Spanish came in and were able to obliterate them completely, and they needed to replace that labor, because for the Spanish it's always about the labor. They need the land and they need the labor. They don't want to empty it completely, because otherwise who's going to work for them? There's all these testimonies of Spanish conquistadors who are like just crying. They're just weeping because they say like, oh, my indios, all of my indios are dying. They're dead. What am I going to do? And it's like, wow, like look at these Spaniards. They're so sad about like killing the indios. They must be really good people. No, it's like, who's going to do my work for me? Who? Like this is a great tragedy for me. This is harming me personally. The death of all these indios like makes my life worse. So I hope they don't die. But like I have to ill-treat them a little bit, because otherwise what's the point? And this is where the whole enslavement of African people begins. Demographic collapse, you need labor, and you're not going to do the work yourself. You have to like find replacement people. Let's look at Brazil for a second, because it has a similar trajectory to the Caribbean, in which you also have, they're arriving around the same time, 1500. They hit Brazil accidentally. They didn't know it was there. And in general, the Portuguese pay very scant attention to Brazil, while the Spanish are all in on the Caribbean. The Portuguese are kind of like, oh, whatever, because they have more interesting stuff to look at in the Indian Ocean, right? That is where the action is. That's where the wealth is. The trade networks coming in from Southeast Asia, much more interesting than the people that they think are primitive that they find in Brazil. They do find this wood. I think it's a scented wood that they go like, okay, this is kind of cool. They call it Brazil wood, which is what eventually gives Brazil its name. Oh, there's a comment from Sir MacDonald. What could be the reason why other European countries, apart from Spain and Portugal, did not initiate a colonial adventure in Meso and South America? At the time, late 15th, early 16th century, a very large chunk of the 16th century, like, yeah, Spain and Portugal are the ones that have all the energy going out into the world, right? The Spanish have just finished the Reconquista, and remember, they finished it in 1492. Um, and they discover the Indies, the Americas in the same year, right? They've got all this energy, all this military religious energy just raging, ready to go. The Portuguese have been exploring as well for a long time. The Portuguese have they're very oceanic sort of people, and they're all good to go. They've got all this stuff ready. So they just have the early advantage, and like they're closer as well. Like the Iberian Peninsula is like jutting out from Europe. They're like closer. They're ready to go. It's also true that other powers did try to get into the South America or the Mesoamerica game. The French tried to set up a colony around Rio de Janeiro in the 16th century, I want to say. They called it French Antarctica, but the Portuguese kicked them out. And the rest of France, eventually the French focused more on North America. So they're just, there's too much on their plate, and they go like, okay, Brazil, French Antarctica, it disappears. And eventually in the 18th century, the Scots, they tried to set up a colony in Panama, but that one didn't work out either. They were clear. There were too much malaria, and the Spanish kicked them out. I think at some point the Dutch, yes, the Dutch, there's Dutch Guyana, right? Suriname, and they did eventually conquer a large chunk of northern Brazil, but they were eventually pushed back by the Portuguese. So they do try, but it doesn't really work out as well for them. I guess in many ways it's because the Spanish. Why did it not work out for them? Because the Spanish and the Portuguese, they just had such a big head start on them. Now, yeah, the Portuguese are more focused on the Indian Ocean, and they're looking at the peoples that they see in the Amazon, and they find them to be kind of primitive, backward, and so on. Especially when they hear stories about the Incas and the Aztecs, they're like, oh yeah, these are, there's not much to trade with them. They're more interested in India. But this is also an interesting laboratory where you see this kind of two theories emerge about Amerindians in the context of Brazilian colonization. They have the noble savage, the idea of the savage who is untainted by the vices of civilization. So they're virtuous. It's kind of like, wow, this is pretty cool. But you also have the idea of the cannibal, the opposite. These people who break all the rules, they break taboos, and they eat other people, and so on. There's always this, wherever the Iberians go, they're always obsessed with trying to find cannibals. They're like, there's got to be a cannibal somewhere. We just want to find them. But at any rate, the Portuguese were a little bit more into the trade idea. The Spanish are definitely more they're definitely more conquery. They're more into conquest, whereas the Portuguese are more into trade. So they do set up the factorias, which they call feitoria in Portuguese. So a lot of the time they're not necessarily conquering them quite as much. Eventually, however, once sugar plantations become a thing, they started enslaving indigenous people, and that led to a lot of conflict. And once again, over here, there's a lot of death among indigenous people, but a lot of it is also just they just flee further inland. And then what do you do as an Iberian person, in this case Portuguese, when you no longer have indigenous slaves, indigenous people whom you can enslave to put into your sugar plantations? What is the Europeans' go-to answer for that? You enslave other people and you bring them over from Africa, right? There's always got to be somebody's going to work for free. Somebody's going to be coerced into work, not white people. It's interesting because in Iberia itself, they would enslave Muslims, but a lot of these Muslims didn't look that different from Spaniards and Portuguese. And the moment that they took those formerly, because everybody had to be baptized, everybody had to convert to Christianity. Once they took those formerly Muslim slaves to the Americas, they very quickly disappear from the historical record, not because they die, but because it's like, oh, well, you're kind of white, so you can't really be a slave, right? So they cease being slaves very quickly due to the color of their skins. Enslavement is for darker skinned people. As we will see eventually, both in Spain and Portugal, they go like, okay, no more enslaving of indigenous people, only black people, which is not better. I mean, it's anybody enslaving anybody is a terrible, terrible thing, of course. There's a question from Rafael. How did the early Spanish conquistadors describe or portray the native Latin Americans in their accounts and chronicles? What does it imply to their identity construction? That is a good question. About the ones in the Caribbean, it's a very similar process, right? It is like like they're also like, wow, look at them living in nature and so on. uh but they also have this and like the idea of like cannibalism is also a thing in the Caribbean. I mean, this it's something that the Spanish are constantly on the lookout for as well. They're always like, oh, they're savages and they're going to like eat people and stuff like that. There's always that concern. And there's warfare in the Caribbean as well, right? You've got like, it is kind of the Spanish who make up these concepts of like, you've got the peaceful Tainos and you've got the warlike Caribs who are in the Southeast Caribbean. It's not all together that accurate, but like there's always this idea of like there are savages out there who will eat you, so be careful, sort of idea. There's always this exoticization. Once they hit the mainland, there's also that thing, because it's like it's completely fascinating for the Spanish, because the Spanish are the ones who find the Aztecs and the Incas, because on the one hand they have these fabulous cities that they're like, wow. They have like these super positive descriptions, especially of the Andes. They go like, wow, they have no famine, which for early modern Europe is like, you know, in early modern Europe, you just know that every 7 or 15 years there's going to be a famine and people are going to die just because there's no food. And that's just part of like, oh, I guess it's a famine year and it's normal, but in the Andes, there's no more famine. They're like, wow, these are so advanced. Of course, they always say like, if only they were Christian. If they were Christian, then they'd be like one of the best people in the world, but they're not Christian. So bad luck, bad luck for them. They gotta conquer them. With the Aztecs, there's also like, definitely with the Aztecs, they play up the human sacrifice side of things. And it's an interesting thing because like a lot of the time when we think about the Aztecs, what do we think about? Human sacrifice, right? The prisoner, the captive, you cut them up, bring out the heart, you sacrifice it for Huitzilopochtli, the still beating heart. It's this whole thing. You eat them the prisoners are also eaten, and it's this whole thing. So, however, the interesting thing, so like for the Spanish, that was the thing, whereas, Aztec life is very complex and rich and so on. And it's kind of one of those things like, yeah, okay, like, yes, we eat people every now and then, but that's not all we do, right? Like, we also, they have all these other cultural things. If you asked an Aztec, like, so what are you guys about? The Aztec would probably not say like, oh, we're that people who eat people. It's like, it's not a thing that they would really, you got to wonder all the different things that, like we do as different people from different countries that like for us is like, it's, you know, yes, so we eat balut every now and then, but that's not like all we do, right? Whereas like for other people like Filipinos, oh, they're the people who eat like balut, like and it's like, yeah, but there's so much more to that to that experience. Um, so yeah, I mean, I hope, does that answer your question, Rafael? And while Rafael comments, let's go to the takeaways of the part about like the Portuguese in this area. So yeah, so the Portuguese, as we said, like they're kind of like on a slightly different trajectory than the Spanish, but they do have very strong similarities in the end, right? They both have the experience of the Reconquista. They're both out into the world, and they're also, as we will talk about this in a little bit more detail later. They also have like this very strong debate within themselves. What are we to do with indigenous people? Because both of these empires, both of the Iberian empires are interesting, and this is probably something that you also know about, like from the Philippines. There's this whole discussion of like, what is the just thing to do? It's not like the Spanish and the Portuguese are just out there killing and conquering people, and they're like, yeah, like more killing, like let's kill as many people as we can. There's a lot of Spaniards and a lot of Portuguese who are also going like, wait a second, this is not a thing that we should be doing, and they have all these debates. Um, so yeah, the feitorias to settlement and exploitation and so on, right? They do start with a trade model, but they eventually start to like set up their own plantations. I was going to talk about the mainland empires, but I think there is I should probably move this to the to our next meeting, because we're like running short on time. Sir Melchor said that it would be good to have like a question and answer session as well. So yeah, maybe we could do that now.
Yes, sir. So thank you, sir, for that meaningful discussion, sir. And so we now open the question and answer portion. So if you have any comment or question,
Sir Melchor, if I may.
yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes,
Yes.
Dean.
Yeah, thank you. No, so Jorge, I would like to clarify some things. No, there are some parallelism with regards to the experience of South American countries and of course the Philippines, especially how the local inhabitants engage the colonizer. Of course, many scholars believe that the two processes of colonization in the Philippines, like for instance, the entrada and the reduction, succeeded, but the third one, the doctrina, in a way, it is a failure until now that we see a lot of quote unquote Filipinizing, no? As described by Pelano, what really the best description of the Philippines is Filipinization of Spanish Catholicism, not really Hispanization. Of course, the phenomenal thesis or book of Dr. Vince Rafael, Contracting Colonialism, discussed that the local inhabitants in this area creatively reacted to Spanish colonialism. So in that context, the hegemonizing power, the hegemonizing authority did not really have that power to really impose. So there were space that the local inhabitants used to engage and basically modify Christianity or Spanish Catholicism in the country. Of course, there are some readings about, for instance, the how the Mother God was appropriated to the Our Lady of Guadalupe and became a symbol of Mexican nationalism. So I would like to be enlightened also. What were the reactions? How did the local inhabitants in Latin America or South America reacted, engaged the colonizers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a very fascinating experience, and I think yeah, this is one of those things that happens throughout colonization and empire, right? This localization of the things that the colonizer want to impose. And Sir Raul points out the very important case of the Virgen de Guadalupe, which I hope we will be able to get into more detail in our next meeting. But yeah, you have this situation in which like a number of elements from pre-Columbian deities are incorporated into like Catholicism. So the Virgen de Guadalupe is associated with Tonantzin, the goddess, the mother goddess in Mesoamerican worldview religion, who, because she's a female goddess and she's a protector goddess, she protects people. And so like it's very easy to relate to like the Virgen, right? Like who cares for people, is this intercessor. And I think that the place where they find the Virgen de Guadalupe is precisely the hill where the temple of Tonantzin used to be. So there is that continuity. In the case of the Andes, you have similar things. There is the god Pachacamac, who is the lord of earthquakes, worshipped in different parts of the Andes. And what they did was they would like kind of find you have the different Jesuses, right? So they're all Jesus, but they're the Jesus of this place. Like the virgins. There's one virgin, but you got the virgin of this place and the virgin of that place, and so on. So you have Jesuses who are associated with specific images of Jesus who are associated with placating earthquakes. And sometimes they would find that, like, they would have the procession with the image of the Christ, but they would also like hide, like, cans of earth or little pots of earth which symbolize Pachacamac. So they're kind of like combining those things. And like for colonial missionaries, it's this constant game of cat and mouse, because they're often like, so yes, they find like, oh yes, how very nice, these Indians are worshiping La Virgen. And they're like, but they're worshiping her a little bit too much. And then they like look behind the painting of the Virgen, and they find like there's coca leaves, which is a way of worshiping the pre-Columbian deities. Or they find that behind the Virgen there's like a little statue representing like an indigenous deity, right? So it's kind of like you've got all of these things that are it's a constant negotiation. There's this constant like struggle between them. Sometimes you also have people who like find Catholicism so appealing that they convert to Catholicism, and they're immediately going like, hey, how can I become a priest? Which makes the Spanish very, very uncomfortable, because they're like, oh, maybe you shouldn't become a priest. Because the problem is a lot of the Spanish colonization of South America and Latin America in general is premised on like, you need priests to reach God. So once there's indigenous priests, it's kind of like, thank you, po, bumalik kayo, sort of situation.
Jorge, can you attribute that to the failure of the hegemonizing power? For instance, like in the Philippines, we are celebrating 500 years of Christianity, but there are so many so-called folk Christianity or folk Catholicism in the country. Can you associate it to the so-called failure of the hegemonizing power?
Is it a failure or is it not? I mean, it's one of those. Where does one put the goalposts? I suppose. I mean, the very fact that the religion continues to be so. And here's a question as well: is Spanish Catholicism a fully Catholic Catholicism? Right? Because a lot of the superstitions that make their way to the Americas are Spanish. There's something about like finding lost items with a scissor or something, with a pair of scissors. You would hang it on a string or something like that, which is a folk superstition. I mean, superstition is a bad word, but like it's something that the Spanish Catholics, the Catholic Church in Spain wanted to eradicate in Spain itself. So not even Spanish Catholicism is pure Catholicism, right? So in some ways, I suppose like all Catholicism is a mix with pre-Christian practices, right? The Christmas tree is a pagan thing. I think the Easter eggs are also pagan. Christmas is in the celebration of Apollo. So, I mean, yes, you do have all these localizations of Christianity, but at the same time, is there any pure Christianity at all? That's a very philosophical question, I suppose.
Yeah. So basically, this is in a way, if this is a failure of the Doctrina, we can attribute it on the other way around as the success of the local inhabitants, because they were able to engage the colonizing power. Yeah, thank you. Actually, I have one question
Yes.
before I give that. What about the way South America treats their women? Because in the Philippines, we really have high regard for women. In fact, the devotion that the Filipinos give to the Blessed Virgin is definitely very high.
Yeah, I mean, there is a very strong rhetoric of like, La Virgen. La Virgen is very important. Some of my Catholic friends were a little bit disappointed in the movie The Passion of the Christ, because there wasn't enough scenes of the Virgin. They wanted to see more más Virgen, por favor. It's but at the same time, Latin America has so yes, there's this rhetoric of like, oh yeah, you do not a la mujer no se le toca ni con el pétalo de una rosa. You do not touch a woman, not even with the petal of a rose. There's a very strong streak of that. But at the same time, Latin America is one of the leading regions in abuse of women, of like violence against women, because there is a very strong machismo, like gender roles, right? Which is as well brought about by colonialism, right? You have all these examples of very independent pre-Columbian women, but Spaniards come in, Portuguese come in, and they start establishing very strong gender roles, which eventually become internalized, right? So you have a very interesting scenario in which you have a lot of very traditional people in Latin America saying, we do not want feminism because feminism is is something brought about by foreigners, without realizing that their machismo that they think is very traditionally Peruvian is also a foreign thing. And the same thing goes with LGBTQ issues, because in the Americas, many cultures had more than two genders. They had like 3, 4, 5, 7 genders, and they were fine with that. You know, like some men have sex with men, some women have sex with women, and that is fine. Whereas nowadays, they have a much more conservative outlook, which is a product of colonialism, and they see gay culture or those sorts of things as something brought from abroad by foreigners.
Thank you, Jorge. Salamat.
Walang anuman. I see some questions over here. I would like to ask about the historiographical. This is from Jamie Carlo. Historiographical framework in Latin America, and how much framework affected the historical consciousness of the people. Do you mean like the is Jamie around? Maybe Jamie could like turn on
Yes,
the
sir.
microphone. Yes. So do you mean like the historical consciousness of people today, or in the conquest period? Hello?
Sir?
Do you mean, when you ask about the historical consciousness of the people, do you mean the people today, or do you mean people back in the period of conquest?
Sir, I'm referring to the people today.
The historical, I mean, that is still a very it's a very strongly debated thing throughout the 20th century. There's a very strong debate throughout Latin America between indigenistas and hispanistas, who were debating through history. It was a debate of what is the history, what is the trajectory of Latin America. Are we a Spanish people, or are we an indigenous people? And they were constantly in this conflict. That debate has kind of died down because there's a very strong in countries like Peru or Mexico, you have a stronger sense of like, oh, we are neither indigenous nor are we Spanish. We are mestizo. We are a mestizo people, which is also a very manipulative kind of rhetoric. The category of mestizo is interesting in Latin America because it's interesting, like where the gaze is supposed to be. In Latin America, yes, mestizo is a neutral term, but at the same time, it is kind of like, if mestizo is kind of seen downwards socially, because like the gaze is assumed to be from the upper class, from the white class, upper white class. Whereas from what I understand, and maybe you guys can like enlighten me a little bit on it, I get the impression that in the Philippines, mestizo is kind of seen upwards. Yeah. So it's interesting. It's interesting how like the same word can have different valences in different parts of the former Spanish Empire. So yes, it is still a strong. It is a debate. Like on Columbus, like around October every year, there's like some people are like, "Yay, Columbus," and some people are like, "Oh, there's nothing to celebrate about Columbus." It is still an ongoing thing. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Junior Lito mentions, or Lito Lacaba Jr. mentions Santa Muerte is folk Catholicism. Yes, they're mixing. Definitely, there's a lot of mixing between folk belief and Catholicism. Uh, Novo Mickey asks, I'm quite curious because I've read about the decline of the current empire. Cuiculoco, Teotihuacan. I've read also the decline of Nino, the recent empires. Huh. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the exact trajectory of what brought down the Olmecs and the Toltecs and Teotihuacan is like a lot of that is archaeological. It is true that in Mesoamerica there's records, but like the exact causes behind the fall of the city of Cuicuilco is something that is a little bit outside of my ken. There is a recent book. What's her name? What is her name? Fifth Son. It is a book on the Aztecs that might have some answers for you in that. What's the name of the author? I can't. Maybe one of you can Google the author of Fifth Son, and you can write the name of the author. Camilla Townsend. I want to say Camilla Townsend, but maybe somebody can confirm. Let's see. Rafael Pamplona, what do you think the reasons and factors why the Latin Americans easily learned to speak Spanish? What were the methods? This I find so fascinating. Number one, because so in the Philippines, there's this the Spanish missionaries decided to learn all the different Philippine languages and evangelize in those languages, right? Which is part of the reason why you still have all a very wide array of different languages in the Philippines. And it seems that they did that because they realized that what they did in the Americas, in Latin America, didn't work out. Because, as we mentioned, the Inca Empire had many languages. The Aztecs also had many languages. And what the Spanish did over there was like, we're not going to learn all these languages. Let's just make everybody learn. So in the Andes, they made everybody learn Quechua. Let's make everybody learn Quechua, and then we will evangelize them in Quechua. So then they took this very varied area and they made everybody Quechua speaking, which is strange. You go like, why not teach them Spanish? Because they figured it's easier to teach them Quechua because Quechua is more similar to the other indigenous languages than Spanish is. So let's make everybody learn Quechua, and we will teach them Christianity in that language. What backfired was like once everybody could kind of communicate in Quechua with each other, they would start coordinating against the Spanish. So then they were like, that is not good. So once they started colonizing the Philippines, they were like, you know what? Let's just make sure people keep on speaking Hiligaynon, Cebuano, Visaya, Tagalog, Bicolano, Ilocano, all these different languages, and let's keep them separated. But okay, but even then, even in the early 20th century, most people in Peru, for instance, did not speak Spanish. More people spoke Quechua. So the fact that Peru speaks Spanish today is more a post-independence thing. It's more like than something that the Spanish did during the colonial period, and that is like a very different trajectory than the Philippines went on to. Because in the Philippines, like once they decided, okay, let's a colonial language that will become a national language, it was English, and there is far more like Philippine languages spoken in the Philippines today than you see Quechua in Peru, for instance. Quechua is understood to be a language for the highlands, for the countryside. I don't think I have ever heard two people in the city of Lima speaking Quechua to each other, whereas you do hear people speaking Tagalog in Manila all the time, like super common, right? I hope that answers that question. Gia asks, what could be the historical roots of the current problem of femicide in Latin America? In the Philippines, we see remnants of our pre-colonial high regard for women amidst the patriarchal structures brought by Spain and America. For Latin America, what could have triggered the femicide today and in recent history? I mean, it's Iberian machismo. I would say there's like "you will obey me, woman" sort of scenario. My brother-in-law studies violence against women, and I think I read a post of his that he finds that like in families where women adhere more to traditional gender roles, they're like the baby makers, the cooks, the cleaners. They do like femicide is much less common. Violence against women is less common. It is in families where the woman works, does like she earns money, she's out of the house. That is where femicide and violence against women is more common because you have men whose masculinity is challenged by women's actions, and thus they have to rectify it by through violence. And like all sorts of like microaggressions against women are very common. I remember when I first moved back to Peru, uh, my sister started dating some guy, and then my friends were like, "Okay, so who is this guy? Have you talked with him yet? Have you like laid down the law? Have you vetted him?" And I was like, I don't. I guess my sister has talked with him and has figured out uh, he's a acceptable guy, and they were like very confused, like why I, as one of the men in the family, did not like give a green light. It's like that's whoever she dates is her. So like there is that whole thing about like male supervision of women. There's a question from Facebook Live viewer. We're out of time. Okay. Buenos días. Historia en la Universidad de San Carlos en la ciudad de Cebu. The major officials to also control. Yeah, Castilians were the ones who took control over the Caribbean and Mexico. That is correct, Leandro. And we'll be able to talk about the galleon, or I don't, maybe not talk that much about the galleon because you guys know all about the galleon, but we might talk about like Asians in Mexico during our next meeting. The Caribbean, Conrad says, that's a good question about the Caribbean and the hurricane belt. I do not know exactly, like, in general, maybe that is one of the motivations for not constructing major architecture in the Caribbean. Why do you build a very complex temple when the hurricane's just gonna come along and knock it down? So instead, you just worship and you spend, because building big temples is hard work. Nobody wants to do that, like unless you can force somebody else to do it for your own glory. So maybe that's a reason. I can't really speak to that. I like give you more information. I will try to find some of my. Oh, but I think a lot of what a lot of what my brother-in-law publishes is in Spanish. Puedes leer español. If you can leer español, I can send it along. And please remember to send me your profiles that I asked for at the beginning of the class so that I can get in touch with you all. Okay. Oh, wow. A lot of questions have come in like at the last. Okay. Since we're out of time, I don't want to keep you all. I am going to copy these questions and I'm going to try to answer them either in video form or in writing, so that like we can all talk about them. So you can I can address them later. I don't want to miss anything from you guys. So anything else that we need to address, Sir Melchor, before we sign off?
Professor Jorge, most of the questions came from the students of our subject, sir. So I will also copy all the questions and send it to you so that all of them may be answered and
Excellent.
our students be satisfied by our discussion, sir.
Wonderful.
So all students or participants may also send questions to Professor Jorge via his email posted in the chat group or in the chat box. So for now, we are finalizing and ending this session. Thank you so much, Professor Jorge, for this wonderful time. For your lecture is very meaningful, and our students learned a lot from you. Even the participants, faculty members of the department, and researchers and participants from other offices or school. So with that, thank you everyone. We are the link for the evaluation form is now posted in our chat box. So kindly answer it, and whoever wants to have a certificate, we will send it to you as soon as we prepare the same. So thank you very much. And at this point, we will now sing the PUP hymn of the university.
Thank you, Jorge. Salamat.
Thank you. Sir Melchor, could we
Thank you, sir.
meet after the session's over?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect.
Sir Melchor, I think mag-picture tayo.
Yes, sir.
After the PUP team. Yeah, thank you. Salamat.
Ikaw taglay, iyong pinamit